Hello and welcome to the first episode of Fic Support, a web series dedicated to offering up assistance to fellow fanfiction writers and/or connoisseurs. I'm Danny $, and my goal is to improve the public image of fan-made works in general while providing some kind of education. While I consider myself somewhat knowledgeable on these topics, please remember that I am by no means a professional. Writing is just a hobby that I'm really passionate about, and I don't really consider anything I say to be part of some ultimate fan works commandments. The goal of this series is just to provide what education I have to offer to others. So with all that said, let's get into the subject of today's video, reader inserts. What are they and how do I write one? I'm going to start us off with a brief vocabulary list. You can find a document link in the description below. This includes words and phrases common to the fanfiction community, as well as some acronyms I've made up myself to save my sanity while writing this. Reader insert characters, or as I like to call them, RICs, can be defined as characters in a written work that are designed to be an in-universe projection of the reader. Chances are you're already quite familiar with this kind of character, even if you've never read fanfiction specifically before. If you're a fan of R.L. Stine's work, then you might have read one of his Reader Beware books. Those qualify as reader inserts. Or perhaps you're more familiar with the visual version of the style, which we can call viewer insert characters. Same idea, but instead of a written work, it's a visual media like a movie or TV show. An example of this would be something like the protagonist in the popular YouTube series Who Killed Markiplier by internet celebrity Markiplier. Another variation of this is the player insert character, which is considerably more common than either two. A popular example of this would be Frisk from Undertale by Toby Fox. These kinds of insert characters are way more common than most people realize. Another term I'll be referring to is original character, more commonly dubbed as OCs. These are characters made by artists or writers, generally made for personal reasons or with intent to use them in a later original project where they later become canon characters. An example of this would be my OC, Anne. She's got her own design and personality, but I haven't made any major project with her yet. It's kind of a journey to find established rules of writing fanfiction, and that's for good reason. Fanworks are meant to be inclusive, self-indulgent works of art for whatever reason. So lots of writers like to use fanfiction as means to experiment with their writing, or perhaps disregard all the strict courtesies found within traditional literature. And I'm all for that, really. But because I think too much, I'm going to try and set up some general rules to the fanfic scene. Like I said before, this isn't written in stone. These are just some unspoken basics I've made note of over my years of reading way too much fanfiction. All that being said, allow me to attempt to establish some general criteria when it comes to writing reader insert fics. Criterion number 1. RICs are often given minimal physical description or none at all. Most people find it hard to project themselves onto a character when the story is constantly referencing all these physical characteristics you may not have. So, more often than not, you will find that reader insert fics don't go too much into the anatomical appearance of the RIC themselves. This, of course, doesn't so much include clothing choices, but some writers also like to keep away from writing description of those things too. And I think I'll just add my own opinion here and say that giving a RIC explicit physical description beyond the basics, so like adding in that your reader character has, pink hair and fuchsia eyes, kinda defeats the purpose of writing a reader insert fic entirely. Criterion 2. RICs are often not explicitly called by any specific name in the story the same way other characters are. While some stories out there get around this challenge by establishing nicknames for the RIC or describing it instead as a narrative action, a line like, "He called your name from within the house," instead of having the line, "Hey Anne," he said from within the house. Reader insert fics avoid having a proper name for the RIC, as it can also be distracting and bothersome to the readers. I also believe that it defeats the purpose of writing a RIC in the first place. Now, of course, these criteria can be ignored, just like any writing rule can be in literature. However, if done without purpose and solely for the sake of breaking said rules, it becomes quite tedious to read. Let's look at some creative exceptions for criteria number 1. Giving physical description to Ricks can be quite a lovely read for certain people who identify with those descriptions. Usually, reader insert fics with this idea come from requests from readers or are altered versions of self-insert stories. More on that later. So, for example, say someone asks me for a fic where the Rick is way shorter than their partner and gets teased for it. Aside from noting the height difference, I would still focus on keeping my Rick physically vague so that not only is the specific reader satisfied, but other people who feel themselves to be shorter than the character in question can enjoy it similarly. Perhaps the greatest thing to remember when wanting to ignore Criteria 1 is focus on 2 or less physical attributes that directly impact the plot. If you start adding more physical descriptions, suddenly it becomes less of a moldable spot to be filled by the reader, and becomes more of an OC. You don't have to take it to the extreme and never mention anything physically about your Rick. Just be a bit more vague and sneaky when it comes to describing their looks. Some physical descriptors include gender or sex, body type, hair length, height, specific or niche fashion choices. This one really isn't important as the others. It's still worth mentioning though. Now let's look at some creative exceptions for criteria number 2. A fair number of readers generally prefer reader insert fics without any specific name for the Rick, but as I mentioned earlier, some fics get away with this when done carefully. Pet names used by other characters in the fic are the most common, but some fics also have the Rick go by an alias for most of the story if it is required by the plot. Like if the Rick character joins a dangerous competition and uses a mysterious name to hide their true identity, adding a mystery element to the story as well as some dramatic tension for the audience. But the big key here is that it should be related to the plot of the story if you're planning on using an established name for the Rick. There is a third criterion that I neglected to mention. The reason I skipped it earlier is because, well, it's not so important to follow when writing a reader insert. But I'll mention it because there are 2 ways this rule, when abused or neglected, can go terribly wrong. Criterion number 3. Ricks often are not written with the specific personality traits that are not related to the plot. See how this one can be a bit tricky? Now, personally, I don't follow this rule all that much. If you look at any of my fanfictions, not imploring you to, I write with a specific personality in mind for all my Ricks, whether they're shy or sour or a bit more complicated. I personally believe that we as writers should want to write all our characters, not just canon characters or OCs, with some kind of idea of personality traits. Without a personality, then our reader doesn't go through any real change or transition. If you're writing an actual plot line, then having a bland, unaffected Rick can turn lots of interested readers off from the story. Even all the drama and smut in the world can't redeem a boring protagonist. Another way personality can cause problems for this kind of fic is found on the other end of the spectrum: too much personality. This can become a problem very quickly for some obvious reasons. Your readers aren't going to be able to relate so easily to your Rick if they're acting in ways unique to their personality. At that point, it would just become an OC insert but without a name or physical description, considering the fic follows the other 2 criteria. With too much personality that doesn't directly influence the plot, readers may not be so willing to read the story and experience whatever your Rick is experiencing, not because it's badly written or that the plot is bad, but because they simply don't connect with the Rick. There are ways you can write a Rick character arc without going off on one of these ends. For example, let's say someone asks me to write a Friends to Lover reader insert AU with Steven Stone from Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. I have my own headcanons about this canon character, and referencing some of his set personality from the animes and the games. Steven is kind of a nerdy guy, but seems outwardly very cool and composed, so I might consider having my Rick be a good foil to his character so they seem more interesting to read about. Something I might do is having Reader and Steven be buddies in college while learning about archaeology, so my Rick would perhaps be simply nerdy. To add some interesting dissonance between them, I might consider writing my Rick as more awkward, acting with much less grace than Steven. A fun dynamic between these 2 characters is already unfolding, and I hardly even had to think about it. From there, I can work on adding more external issues to complicate their friendship and in turn allow them to find a path towards romance. Of course, it's not always going to be that simple. But then again, this is just me speculating. Chances are the final draft of the fic may not even have those ideas. But me looking at just a couple of generic personality traits for our Rick has helped me establish the internal plot for this fic. Reader is awkward, Steven is cool, how will they end up in a relationship? Little stuff like that can really help when writing a story that people love and that you can enjoy writing. Now that we know all the basics of what qualifies as a pure reader insert fic, let's look at how they compare and contrast from other fanfiction classifications. How exactly can you tell if your fic is a reader insert versus an OC insert, or even a self-insert? Using what we learned in the basics section, there's a few indicators that can help you best tag your stories online. A true reader insert will follow at least the first two of the given 3 criteria I mentioned earlier. It is a story that focuses on bringing the reader themselves into the universe of your story, allowing them to live vicariously through this pliable protagonist. A self-insert, however, is more of a personal work made by and for the author. It's exactly how it sounds, a fanfiction in which the writer puts themselves into the story to live vicariously through their own words. Generally, self-inserts will have more personality that doesn't outright affect the plot as compared to reader inserts. They may also include physical description of the self-insert character, or even refer to them by name. Also, while this isn't always the case, many of these fics are what I call catharfics. Fanfictions that are meant for the writer to live vicariously through some emotional experience with the canon characters, generally as means for coping. I plan on going into more detail on these kind of fanfictions in a later video, so don't worry so much about all that for now. Surprisingly enough, you may also find that there are some reader insert fics that were adapted from self-insert fics written by the author, just without instance of name, physical description, and all that. And there really is nothing wrong with that. It's a great way to repurpose these kind of fics without feeling maybe embarrassed, or maybe that's just me. But if you plan on repurposing a self-insert fic of your own, consider going through the RIC criteria before hitting that publish button. Now, what about OC insert fics? OC insert fics are, of course, works of written fan content that use an original character in the place of the protagonist, or perhaps are just used as secondary characters, but let's just assume that the OC is the protagonist for now. These are most easily discernible as compared to RICs, or SICs, is that really what I'm gonna call them? Ugh. Anyway, OC inserts are written no different than canon character-only fics, or entirely original stories. It's just that they include at least one OC within the scheme of a separate canon universe, to generally play the part of the protagonist. Again, nothing inherently wrong with these fics, but there is a big problem regarding writers not knowing the difference between an OC insert and reader inserts. Maybe you've also had this problem. You jump into a reader insert fic because you're in the mood to be paired up with your current comfort character, only to find that halfway through chapter 1 it's actually the writer's OC and not actually a reader insert character. I always get so sad when this happens because it feels almost like a betrayal. Now, I'm not talking when stories put in their description or in their tag something like named reader or female reader or OC you can project onto or whatever. I'm talking about those fics where it literally straight up says reader/canon or whatever and is framed exactly like your average reader insert. And guys, that counts as false advertising. Trust me, I get it. Reader inserts are statistically more popular than OC inserts, and reader inserts are kind of difficult to write. Having to find ways to get around physical description of your main character or not saying their name, it's hard. But just like different genres of literature, it's a learned skill, not something you just jump into. You practice and you learn what works for you and your audience. And while writing should always be about the story you want to tell, it's not right just to say, oh well, I don't like writing unhappy characters in your dystopian fic. If you want to write in a specific style, you should at least make an effort to follow the rules of that style. Just like in traditional creative writing, there are many styles and formats for writers and readers alike to choose from. While reader inserts can be said to be some of the most popular kinds of fanfiction classifications out there, no one class is objectively any better than the other. I've read some marvelously fantastic OC insert fics out there. I've also read some abysmal reader inserts too. At the end of the day, it becomes about preference of the writer and preference of the audience. It's important to have a general idea of your intended audience when beginning a reader insert. In your fandom, does a certain canon character have headcanons that are unconsciously accepted by most of the fans? Do you know of any fun plots left unattempted in your fandom? Or any plots you loved and want to add your own twist to? You can't possibly win every reader, and might even get hate for writing pure gold. But it's not always about the public response. Did you have fun writing? What did you learn? What did you gain from this experience? So, to wrap things up, reader insert fics have 2 or 3 rules of thumb that writers should keep in mind when attempting this style. It's important to mention that if you aren't sure of what classification your fic falls into, reach out to your community. Find some respected writers or readers to give you input, and I'm sure they'll be able to help you along the way. When you publicize your work, it's due for both praise and criticism, so don't get angry or embarrassed when you hear that your fic didn't meet the style you were hoping for. Just make sure to tag it appropriately and move on. Remember, writing is a skill, a learned experience that can grow beautifully with time, regardless of whether it's for profit, for praise, or for pleasure. I hope you guys learned something with this video. Leave your thoughts down in the comments below, good, neutral, or constructive. This series will include various other topics regarding written fan content, so feel free to subscribe with notifications if you're interested in hearing more. That concludes the first episode of Fic Support. Have a good one!